You guys want some snacks?
I was eyeing your pistachios.
I have some. I have
Okay, so
all the
today,
stuff from work. I got all this stuff from work too, if you want more.
we're going over FARs. Well, we're going to go over the stuff that basically you probably looked at yesterday. How many people got through yesterday's stuff? Anybody?
I finally got through this morning.
Okay. Well, you probably saw, the study guide didn't have any questions about FARs, so I knew that would have been too much. So today we're going to look at, and we're going to talk about some of the specific FARs that are in there. So those of you that haven't seen them yet, and those of you that have, and this will help kind of remember them easier. And obviously those of you that haven't seen any of them yet, this will be hopefully a good video to refer back to when you need at the end. So there's a lot of FARs, obviously, that, and anybody that works for an airline knows this, even if you're not in dispatch. There's all sorts of different of FARs, but the big thing that we are trying to remember here as dispatchers and becoming licensed, there's really just one specifically that we need to know and remember. The big thing about FARs, though, is that you're not going to always remember every FAR word for word, and have it memorized. There are specific ones that you do need to know as a dispatcher that you do need to have memorized.
Are FARs just like emails or what?
Well, Federal Aviation Regulations. So yeah, sorry. If I refer to FARs or FARs, it's just talking about Federal Aviation Regulations. So there are going to be some that you need to have memorized. Those will be the majority of your quiz questions next week. So this week really is going to be a big focus on learning the FARs and specifically the dispatch ones that you need to know. Also, the big thing about FARs too is this is one portion that'll probably that really does coincide well with the ADX. You do see a lot of questions about FARs on the ADX. So this is one that should help both the ADX and obviously in class. The other thing about FARs is a lot of these questions about the FARs, or a lot of these specifically the ones you need to memorize, are usually interview questions as well when you interview, at least at SkyWest. And I worked at 3 different places, and at all 3 of them, they were interview questions. And sometimes you also take a test, like if you're going in for an interview, sometimes they'll give you a test ahead of the interview to complete. And a lot of times you'll see a bunch of questions about FARs on that test, as well as once you get into the interview, they'll just, ask you questions.
What's the interview like? Is there multiple people in there with you?
Usually at least 3.
Okay.
If not 4 or 5.
So it's more like based on, the interview will be more based on like what we've learned, not like
what they expect you to know. So now remember, there is a big, there's a big difference between what they expect you to know as a freshly licensed dispatcher and someone who is a tenured dispatcher. Now, when, at SkyWest, you get people applying that have experience and some that don't. And you have people, the makeup of all of their new hire classes are probably 50-50. About 50% have experience and 50% don't. They do like to hire people in both categories. There's an advantage to hiring somebody who's freshly licensed that, SkyWest always considers themselves the best regional. So they like to hire people that, they also like to think of it as they don't have any bad habits. So a lot of times you go to other airlines and you'll pick up bad habits based on their training programs and what they do there. And that's true of anything. And really the big thing is too is, a lot of times if you're hiring people with experience, there's a lot of untraining. And that's not necessarily because they're doing it wrong, but it's just because you do it differently here. Your training processes are going to be different. So yeah, they do like to hire a good amount of both categories. They like to hire people with experience because there's a lot of things they're already going to know. But based on your resume, they're going to ask you questions based on what they think you should know. And what you're going to learn in this class and getting your license here is what you should know as a freshly licensed dispatcher. You're not going to know all the ins and outs of everything it takes to be a dispatcher at a given airline, but you are going to know, they do expect you to really know your FARs, what we're about to go over. They do expect you to know basic things like, what's drift down, if they said something like that, or what is, anything basic, anything that, those are the things that we try to touch on in this class. And just remember that everything in here is really just scratching the surface of any given subject that we go over. So they don't expect you to have in-depth knowledge. They know that it takes 5, 6, 7, 8 or more years to really, it's a never-ending process of learning. So you're not expected to know things that, people with 10 years know, So the first area that we are going to look at in the FARs is Part 91, okay? Part 91 of the FARs is specifically for just general aircraft operations. It's more or less for, it's not necessarily for like revenue flights, but this is kind of just general aircraft rules in this section that everybody has to follow. Okay, this is not just airlines that has to follow these rules, but it's anybody out flying an airplane. Whether you're a private pilot, whether you're student pilot, commercial pilot, instrument pilot, it doesn't matter. You got to follow these rules, okay? So we're only going to, there's a ton more that are in here that we actually look at. I'm only putting the ones in here that you need to know, expected to know. So the first one, and it will kind of seem kind of sporadic, like, well, we're suddenly talking about aircraft speed, then we're talking about this. It will jump around, but so just expect that. But aircraft speed is the first thing that we look at in Part 91 of the FARs. And there's also a lot of language in here that you just have to become familiar with. When it talks about, so like right here, this opening sentence here, it says, unless otherwise authorized by the administrator. When it says administrator, that always is referring to the FAA. Okay, they are the administrator. When it talks about, when it says, later on when we get into 121, when it talks about the certificate holder is the airline. Okay, so if you can start thinking of subbing these words in your head, sub administrator with FAA, sub certificate holder with airline, and there's other ones as we go along I'll point out, but just so you know, because you'll hear a lot of repetition, and reading through these things really, it's the closest you probably ever come to suicide. So I don't like to read them verbatim either because it's just too much, it makes less sense when you do that, it seems to me. So anyway, so starting off, aircraft speed, this is saying that no person may operate an aircraft below 10,000 feet at an indicated airspeed of more than 250 knots. Okay, so this is any person, any aircraft. It doesn't matter who you are, what you're flying, whether you're an airline flying people or you're just some dude in a Cessna. If you are below 10,000 feet MSL, okay, mean sea level, you cannot fly more than a speed of 250 nautical miles per hour. So remember that. Promise you that will be on the quiz next week.
Is that the same for like,
Are we on week 5?
they do like the air shows?
Unless, there's certain authorizations that they give for just those types of things. But generally speaking, if you're below 10,000 feet, you can't be over 250 knots. When you get your dispatch licenses and you start jump seating and doing your observation rides, you'll see this. You'll if you just watch until they get to 10,000 feet, there's a lot of things that happen at 10,000 feet. Okay, one of them is simply once they're above 10,000 feet, they can now go over 250 knots. The other one in it for an airline is that's usually when you can turn on your electronic devices. So a lot of times you'll hear that announcement, we've reached the safe altitude that you can now turn on, Andrea, I'm sure could recite this for us. But 10,000 feet is for SkyWest flights, you hear the double chime, and that's basically indicating to the flight attendants that that electronic devices and things like that can be turned on, in the non-transmitting mode, airplane mode. So anyway, so that's one there. The next little part of this says, unless otherwise authorized or required by air traffic control, no person may operate an aircraft at or below 2,500 feet and above the surface within 4 nautical miles of the primary airport of a Class C or Class D airspace at an indicated airspeed of more than 200 knots. So this paragraph is saying does not apply to any operations within a Class B airspace. So this is basically just saying that if you are within 4 miles of a Class C or a Class D airport, essentially, or a Class C or D airspace, which is always going to be an airport, you can't, if you're below 2,500 feet, you can't go more than 200. That's not going to be a quiz question. The big one so far is still just the 250 below 10,000. So next part, no person may operate an aircraft in the airspace underlying a Class B airspace designated for an airport or in a VFR corridor designated through such a Class B airspace at an indicated airspeed of more than 200 knots. So does everyone remember what the different airspaces look like? Yes, that is exactly what I was going to say. So Class B is an upside down wedding cake. Okay, so Class B looks like, you got a big ring on the top, then this, smaller, and then as you get closer to the ground, it's smaller as you're higher up. Now, if you are, let's say you are below, not inside any of those rings, but let's say you are below that top ring, but not inside that middle one. Does that make sense? Uh-huh. Not inside Class B, but you are below it. So if you were to go straight up, then you would go through the top one, let's say. If you are below Class B, you can't fly more than 200. So if you ever get asked the question, that this question specifically, where it says, what speed, if you're at or below 10,000 feet, what is the max speed you can fly? The correct answer to this is 250 knots or 200 if you're below Class B. Does that make sense? Really, the big thing I want you to remember is just the 250 below 10,000, but the true correct answer is 250 below 10,000, or if you're underneath Class B and also underneath 10,000, then it's only 200 would be your max speed. So it just depends on if you're below Class B. Okay. This next part, IFR flight plan. So unless otherwise authorized by air traffic control, also going back to that first one real quickly, the only other situation that you could fly more than 250 or less if you're more restricted, kind of the third part of that answer would be or whatever ATC is assigning you. So if ATC actually tells you to go more than 250, you can go more than 250. Or if they're telling you to only go 230, then only go 230. But generally speaking, 250 is your limit below 10,000 feet. Unless you're below Class B, then it's 200. And then the only other part to that, or as directed by ATC, faster or slower. Okay. Okay. So unless otherwise authorized by ATC, each person filing an IFR flight plan must include the following information. So what is an IFR flight plan? Instrument flight rules. And what does it specifically mean, though? What's the difference between VFR and IFR?
No visual flying by instruments only.
Correct. Even if you're in total visual conditions, it's still an instrument. So everything we file in the airline world is an IFR flight plan. We do not file any VFR flight plans. And no airline files any VFR flight plans. If you're filing a flight plan, that basically means it's IFR. That means the ATC is going to follow you. They're going to be noticing you and wondering where you are and communicating with you. So each person filing an IFR flight plan must include the following information. Let's see here. One of those is going to be, so there's this, it says refer to 91-153, which we're not going to look at specifically. It just tells you, the big thing about this one that you need to know is an alternate airport. So all IFR flight plans require an alternate airport. Okay? So if you are flying Part 91 and you file an IFR flight plan, regardless of what the weather is, you're supposed to file an alternate airport with that. Okay, now, what's your question?
Like the 1, 2, 3 rule.
Yes, there is that rule, which we'll look at in a little bit, but it ultimately is, the 1, 2, 3 rule is for airlines only. So going back to what we're talking about here in 91,
So they're going to be like,
yeah, 91 is for all aircraft, generally speaking. Now, when you get into the airline world, well, you'll see here in just a minute, because the next part that actually talks about it here a little bit. So by definition, all IFR flight plans require an alternate. Okay. So this next part says, let's see. So Part 97 of this chapter prescribes a standard instrument approach procedure to, or a special instrument approach procedure has been issued by the administrator or the operator for the first airport of intended landing. And this next part is where you get into the 1, 2, 3 rule. Appropriate weather reports or weather forecasts or a combination of them indicate the following. For aircraft other than helicopters, for at least 1 hour before and for 1 hour after the estimated time of arrival, the ceiling will be at least 2,000 feet above the airport elevation and the visibility will be at least 3 statute miles. So ultimately what we're getting at with this specific FAR is it's saying that all flights require an alternate unless this rule, the 1, 2, 3 rule exists. Does that make sense? So the reason I'm kind of putting it in these terms and kind of looking at it this way is because you'll sometimes get asked a trick question, okay? Some people will say, like, you might have in your practical exam, or I'm not sure if it asks this on the ADX very much, but you might get asked the question, when is an alternate required? And what is the automatic answer to that?
All the time.
required.
Always, exactly. An alternate is always required unless the 1, 2, 3 rule exists, right?
So not follow the 1, 2, 3.
So what is that?
So the 1, 2, 3 rule is for at least 1 hour. So when you're looking at, going back to the weather reports, if you're looking at the TAF, right? You look at the TAF and you figure out what your ETA is of your flight, you'll kind of know more or less what your ETA is. You look at your ETA and then you go backwards 1 hour and then forward 1 hour. So you have this window of an hour before, an hour after you're supposed to get there. If anywhere inside of that forecast, if the ceiling is 2,000 feet or below, should say below 2,000 feet, and the visibility is below 3 miles, then an alternate is required. Then you have to list one. So, but the way the rule states is that all flights need an alternate unless you have more than 2,000 foot ceiling and more than 3 miles visibility 1 hour before to 1 hour after your ETA. So that's the 1, 2, 3 rule. So just remember 1, 2, 3 is 1 hour before and after, 2,000 miles visibility, or 2,000 or below, and then below 3 miles statute miles visibility.
Does that happen often?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I go an entire day. In fact, I think we kind of have these little stupid games in dispatch, to kind of on a slow, boring day to kind of kill off the boredom sometimes. Some days are busy, some days are not busy. Like yesterday was an awesome weather day. This whole week, really the last 4 or 5 days, other than Hurricane Irma, the rest of the country has been great weather for flying. But sometimes, does everyone ever kind of hear the sports terms like baseball terms? Does everyone know what a perfect game is or a no-hitter? Mm-hmm. Okay. So we kind of have similar terms a little bit in dispatch just to have fun with. So in dispatch, if you go an entire day without listing an alternate, that's a no-hitter. So, you're talking 50 to 60 flights. None of them have an alternate. I mean, that's pretty good, right? Yeah. I mean, nowhere. I mean, we dispatch to the entire United States, Mexico, Canada, and Alaska at SkyWest. So to say that nowhere in there needed an alternate is, I mean, it's no-hitter-esque, like, in the baseball world. It's a pretty big deal. And so you'll start talking about it, people will start giving you the silent treatment,
Don't look at him, don't touch him.
Don't talk to him. He's got a no-hitter going. He's into his 7th bank. Anyway, so that's a no-hitter. But we also have a perfect game, which is a little bit more, perfect game is better than a no-hitter. Perfect game is not only no alternates, but there's other things that have to kind of apply to it, though. It's not delays, because that would never happen. First of all, that one is not one that you can ever bank on. You have to look at it from a workload standpoint. A delay to a dispatcher means nothing. It means no extra work, technically, if he knows about it. Because you're not going to work up a flight if you know it's delayed, right? So it's not causing you to work until you know that it needs to, until the flight's due. So even if it's delayed 7 hours, and sometimes delays help out, and so do cancellations. I mean, dispatchers love cancellations because it means they don't have to worry about that flight. So, but a delay, it means nothing. The only time a delay hurts you is when you already worked up the flight, sent the release, and then it got delayed, and then you have to redo it. But that's part that kind of works into the perfect game thing. So perfect game is no alternates. So in baseball, it's no hits, no errors, basically nobody reaching base at all. No runs, no hits, no errors, okay, and nobody reaching base. So in the baseball world, a perfect game, if it's a team effort technically. It's not only the pitcher. The pitcher can control the no-hitter part 100% on his own. Not that a dispatcher can control no alternates, but a pitcher can control no hits. However, in order to get no errors, it's the entire team. So if you have a no-hitter going, or let's say you have a perfect game going, but then a guy hits a soft grounder to the third baseman, which should be an out. It should be a routine grounder, but the third baseman botches it and it rolls under his legs. Well, that's an error, right? It doesn't count as a hit, but it is an error. So even though the guy ends up reaching, it's also no walks. It's a perfect game. In a no-hitter, you can have walks, you can have errors, you can even have runs scored against you. The only thing that counts is no hits, as long as they didn't get any hits. But if you walked 4 people in a row and they scored a run off of it, then they score a run, but they didn't get any hits, though. But a perfect game is no runs, no hits, no errors, no walks. And it's the ultimate thing is nobody reaches base, whether it be by error, because you can reach base in a lot of different ways. You can bean somebody, you can walk them, you can have an error. So it's a collective effort. That's a perfect game. So in the dispatch world, it's no alternates, no swaps, okay? And swaps means that the coordinator swaps, like they can swap your aircraft. Like if you get an aircraft swap after you've done a release, then you have to redo the release because now it's on a new plane. So you're going to learn about what is required on the release, but part of what's required on the release is the tail number that you're flying. So if you send a release and then the coordinator person decides to swap airplanes on you, then you got to redo the whole thing. So no alternates. It's basically, the way you look at it from a dispatcher standpoint is you do every release that you had assigned to you, you did one time and one time only. You never had to redo any release, and none of them had alternates. So anyway, that's a perfect game, and they're very rare.
And he gets free lunch, right? Or she.
Really, other than just the satisfaction of...
You just need to take their picture and make it be bored.
Yeah.
Perfect game.
The last time I had a perfect game, I have had a perfect game, but it was probably a year or two ago.
That's pure luck, though.
What's that?
That's all just pure luck. Right?
It is. Part of it, though, is there's kind of a little bit of a part to it, though, that like the no alternates is definitely pure luck, but the swaps, if you can foresee, sometimes you can foresee swaps. So as long as you don't do the release before it gets swapped, sometimes being a coordinator helps knowing whether you might get swapped, but throwing a perfect game also, same deal though too, so.
That sucks if it's like your last plane of the day. You get like swapped like right at the very end.
Yeah.
You have to do an alternate.
I had an alternate on my last flight one time of a perfect game. So yeah.
Devastating.
Yes.
You're just like, someone else come do this plane for me.
Anyway.
The players got injured.
So back on task here. So yeah, the 1, 2, 3 rule is 1 hour before and after your ETA, the ceiling will be at least 2,000 feet above the airport elevation and the visibility will be at least 3 statute miles. That is the 1, 2, 3 rule. There's a few added things in here. Nothing that really changes that rule, but it says no person may include an alternate airport in an IFR flight plan unless appropriate weather reports or forecasts or a combination of them indicate that at the estimated time of arrival, at the alternate airport, the ceiling and visibility at that airport will be at or above the following weather minimum. If an instrument approach has been established or a special instrument approach procedure has been issued by the operator for that airport, the following minimums apply. So this is for your alternate airports. For aircraft other than helicopters, for a precision approach procedure, the ceiling must be at least 600 feet and the visibility 2 statute miles. Now, I don't need you guys to remember any of these ones specifically. These are the general rules for Part 91 operating people, okay? So if you look at it this way, you have a bunch of different sets of rules. Part 91 is one set of rules. Then you've got Part 135, which is a whole other set of rules. That's for like charter carriers. And then you got Part 121, which is airline carriers. They all have different rules in them. Airlines in general, because they're held to higher standards, a lot of times they get less restrictions as far as, minimums and weather and things like that. going back to the 1, 2, 3 rule, that rule is for your destination, okay? It is for your destination. The weather needs to be 2,000 feet or ceiling or better, and better than 3 statute miles visibility. That's in order to not have to list an alternate, okay? Now, if you do have to list an alternate, that's what this next one is talking about. So this is basically saying, well, if you do need an alternate, you can't list one that has crappy weather, right? I mean, it defies the entire purpose of listing an alternate, right? If you list an alternate that has worse weather than your destination, what's the point? So this is basically saying if you list an alternate, then the alternate has minimum weather criteria that it needs as well. It doesn't have the whole 1 hour before, 1 hour after thing. It's just basically saying at the ETA, at your expected ETA at your alternate. So if you were landing at your destination or expected to land at your destination, let's say 8 o'clock, right? That's when you were expected to get there. So from 6 to 9 o'clock, you have to have that 1, 2, 3 rule variables. If it's below the 2,000 foot ceiling or the 3 miles visibility, you got to list an alternate. Well, then you figure out, well, what's my ETA at the alternate? Well, if my ETA at the destination was supposed to be 8 o'clock, and let's say this alternate of mine is 50 miles away, that's going to take me 25 minutes, let's say. After you shoot the approach at the destination, you don't land because or whatever, and then you end up going or diverting to your alternate. Let's say it's 20 minutes. So let's say your ETA is 8:25 at your alternate. Well, at 8:25 in the TAF at your alternate, these weather minimums need to exist. Okay, and this is always talking about the TAF in these situations, but a 600-foot ceiling for an airport that has a precision approach. Okay, does everyone remember precision approach? That's an approach with both vertical and horizontal guidance. It has to be a 600-foot ceiling and 2 statute miles visibility. If the airport you're diverting to or your alternate only has a non-precision, then it needs to be 800-foot ceiling and 2 statute miles. Okay? Like I said, this one you don't necessarily need to remember. These are the general, not Part 91 operating rules.
So even if your original destination airport is, better weather than this, you still have to list an alternate if it's not the 1, 2, 3 rule.
You have to list an alternate. It doesn't necessarily mean that you won't be able to land when you get there.
Right.
So
you just have to have one, even if it's worse weather than what your original airport destination is.
yeah. Yeah, in this case, you have to, your alternate might need an alternate, if that makes sense, based on if you looked at the 1, 2, 3 rule, and applied it to the alternate, which you don't do, but it's basically just saying your alternate needs to have minimum weather criteria. Now, in this case, those criteria are worse than the 1, 2, 3 rule, but if you look at it from the sense of, well, if not only would your destination have to completely tank, but then your alternate would have to as well. So it's the probability goes down dramatically, which is why the weather minimum goes down dramatically.
Okay.
However, the fact that you need to list an alternate doesn't necessarily mean much. I mean, because 2,000 foot ceiling, if you had if let's say it said 1,900 feet, so it's just barely in there, barely got to list an alternate, then that's nothing. I mean, you're never going to have a problem landing in that situation. Most pilots, the way they're trained nowadays, even down to even a half-mile visibility is not really ever going to be a problem. So it's just basically saying by precautions, for precaution's sake, you just need to list an alternate, even though it's highly unlikely that you would need to even divert there. Now, there's more FARs that we're going to look at, but this is just for listing an alternate. So later we're going to look at another one that talks about being legal to launch the flight at all. There's a whole other weather criteria just for that. So it'll all kind of come full circle and make a little bit more sense once we apply everything together after we kind of look at everything. But this one here is just talking about alternate weather minimums. If you have to list an alternate, your alternate needs this minimum criteria. However, I'm going to just basically tell you that don't worry about remembering this specific one, because once we get into the 121, you're going to actually learn the one that's for airlines specifically, and that's the one you'll need to remember. So this is the one that just general aircraft, which is us, but yet not us, because we abide by 91, and then we also, furthermore, we abide by 121, which
So the 121 would be more strict then?
it would be less restrictive in our case. So yeah, you'll kind of see why and how we get to that point, but alternate minimums is all we're worrying about right now for 91, part 91. So this next part is takeoff minimums. This is another one this is the generic rule for all airplanes. It ultimately is not going to be the one that we go off of for 121 airline rules, but let's just see what it says here regardless. Unless otherwise authorized by the FAA, no pilot may take off from a civil airport, which just means really any airport, under IFR flight plan, unless the weather conditions at the time of takeoff are at or above the weather minimums for IFR takeoff prescribed for that airport. Now, in order to look at that, we have to look at each airport individually. And how's it going? For those of you watching at home, we just had pizza delivered somehow, unknowingly. Chantel ordered pizza.
Oh my gosh, that smells so good.
Yeah, Garrett, that's what you used to do in class, I remember. He always used to, when I used to teach up at Salt Lake Community College, Garrett was notorious for making pizza runs.
I thought he'd send you pizza. That'd be fun. Like right in the middle of your class.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was that's why he didn't end up with his license. He was the pizza guy.
Anybody can herself.
We'll take a break here in just a second at 8 o'clock. But yeah, just finishing up this one real quick, the takeoff and landing. This is just basically saying that each airport has its own weather minimums in order for takeoff. And so there's a generic rule, and that's what we're about to read here, but it says for aircraft other than helicopters having 2 engines or less, the rule is 1 statute mile visibility. So it has to be at least 1 mile visibility in order to take off. That's kind of your blanket rule, unless the airport itself has a higher requirement. Okay, now if the airport doesn't have a requirement, sometimes it won't list it. If it's a mile or less, they don't bother listing it at all, because they know that the FAA rule is 1 mile for 2-engine aircraft. Now, if it's more than 2 engines, then it's a half mile. So, we don't really get into the more than 2-engine category much, but so some airports, if you're in a mountainous environment or things like that, sometimes they might have a 2-mile restriction. If that's the case, they'll list it. It'll be in their charts. When you look up that airport individually, you'll be able to see. But if it doesn't say anything, then you should just know automatically that it's 1 mile for a 2-engine aircraft. Now, once again, this is just the general rule. Once we get into 121, we go off of a total different set of rules that you'll see. But yeah, we'll look at that once we get to it. So for now, we will take just a 10-minute break here real quick and continue in a minute. Okay, so So back to this, takeoff minimums. Got that covered. We're going to learn more about that later. This next little part is an RVR conversion chart. Most of the big airports report, like when the weather is really low, they report RVR values. So you just need to become familiar with what RVR value equates to the equivalent, statute miles. So 1,600 feet is supposed to be your quarter mile. 2,400 feet is supposed to be half. 3,200 feet, 5/8. Anyway, and so on and so forth here.
Oh, those are just really tiny.
Okay, operation specifications. This next part here, this will be a quiz question, so get to know this, because operation specifications is, first of all, I'm going to tell you what it is, okay? We call them op specs for short, first of all. That's typically how we refer to them, op specs. But every airline has an op specs, and it's kind of like a working document per se, but the document describes all of like the fundamental workings of the business, if that makes sense, like how it operates, where, who its main people are, basically, like say like the president of the company, the director of maintenance, the director of flight operations. I mean, it tells you who the main basic stakeholders are in the company from a person standpoint. It tells you what kind of authorizations the airline has, what type of limitations, procedures that it can do, different kinds of operations. It has a list of all the airports that it's authorized to fly to and from, has a list of all of the aircraft registration numbers that belong to the company. It has, it's basically this big document that contains all of these different things. So a quiz question for this would be, be able to name probably a minimum of 4 or 5 things that are contained in an airline's op specs. Okay, so we've named a few. You could say authorizations. You could say list of aircraft, list of airports that it's authorized to fly to. There's also another big thing that's contained in the op specs, which are called exemptions, okay? Exemptions are specifically relating to FARs. A lot of airlines have these exemptions that make them not have to abide by certain federal aviation regulations, okay? Perfect example of this is we got done talking about those alternate minimums a minute ago and the takeoff minimums, okay? SkyWest has an exemption to both of those FARs, meaning that they don't have to follow that rule. So that alternate weather minimum rule that said 600-foot ceiling, 2 miles visibility for a precision approach, 800-foot ceiling and 2 miles visibility for a non-precision approach. SkyWest has an exemption in their op specs, which has been given to them and granted to them by the FAA, that says SkyWest doesn't have to follow this exemption. Instead, they have this criteria that they go off of. So we'll look at that later, though, once we get into the 121 stuff. They have another one for the takeoff minimums that says SkyWest doesn't have to follow that general Part 91 rule. They have to follow this other rule, which is a little bit more forgiving, basically. So exemptions, a list of, like the name of, the president and the directors of the company, essentially. So yeah, there are the company address, like the headquarters address would be another one you could even put in there. DBA names, so DBA stands for doing business as, but any names that the company does business as. So for instance, SkyWest, we have like 4 or 5 different DBAs. We have SkyWest Airlines, but we also have SkyWest Airlines doing business as Delta Connection, doing business as United Express, doing business as American Eagle, doing business as Alaska, operated by SkyWest. So all of those names are DBAs for SkyWest technically as well. So DBA names, there's a bunch of different things, but that's what the op specs is. We'll if we have time in the class, we'll actually jump into the SkyWest op specs and just take a look at it, see what's in there. But there's a bunch of other things that allow us to, do different things and have lower weather minimum criterias and stuff like that. So it's an important thing, and once again, we refer to it as just the op specs. So actually this next part here has a list. So contents. These following things are things that have to be in the op specs. Certificate holder's name is the location of the certificate holder's principal base of operations. Certificate number, certificate's effective date, the name and designator of the certificate holding district office. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. Other business names under which the certificate holder may operate. Whether it's a domestic or a flag or commuter operation. So SkyWest is primarily a domestic operated airline, but they also have authorization to do flag as well. So they have the authorization to domestic and flag operations. I was telling Scott here earlier what the difference is between domestic and flag. Does anyone know the difference or what those two things are? So domestic operations mean a flight that starts and ends in the lower 48 United States. So you take off from somewhere within the lower 48 and you land within somewhere in the lower 48. A flag operation would be anything that is not that. So starts in the lower 48, ends in Canada. Starts in Canada, ends in the lower 48, or to Mexico or anywhere. So that's what the definition of domestic and flag is. It also could be, a lot of people confuse it and they think, well, U.S. to U.S. is always going to be domestic, but it's not. Like U.S. to Alaska is flag. U.S. to Hawaii is flag. U.S. to Puerto Rico, even though it's a U.S. territory, is flag. So the domestic is simply just within the lower 48. Okay, so airlines have a completely different set of rules. If you are on a domestic operation, you got one set of rules. If you're a flag operation, you got this set of rules. Now, in the op specs for SkyWest, we do a lot of flights to Canada. We fly to Alaska. We fly to Mexico. Sometimes we even fly down into the Bahamas and some other places in the Caribbean. SkyWest has an authorization from the FAA, which also is an exemption technically as well, that they can operate all of their flights that we do from the U.S. to Mexico or the U.S. to Canada or the U.S. to the Bahamas. We have authorization to actually treat all of our flights as if they're domestic, even though some of them should be flag. If it's U.S. to Mexico, U.S. to Canada, they give you a few extra things that you have to abide by, but as long as you abide by an extra set of rules, then they allow us to treat all of our flights as if they are a domestic operation, which helps us a lot, especially once you've learned the differences between the two. Totally different fuel requirements, like when you fuel an aircraft and your reserve fuels and things like that. For a domestic operation, it's totally different than it is for a flag operation. So, and we'll see those because we're going to see them here in the FARs. But anyway, that's what the op specs are. They have all of these different things. So kinds of operations, authorizations, limitations, routes, areas of operation, airport limitations. Anyway, you can see all of these different things. Just be able to name 4 or 5 of those on a quiz question. But the list is pretty long. Management personnel required for operations conducted under Part 121. So now we are into Part 119. Actually, I think we got into it. Yeah. Actually, the OpSpecs part started 119. But anyway, there are 5 different requirements, like airline position requirements, that an airline has to have, and they have to list these people in the OpSpecs. They have to list the Director of Safety, the Director of Operations, the Chief Pilot, the Director of Maintenance, and the Chief Inspector. So those 5 people, and you can list more than that, but you have to have at least those 5 people, their name and that title in your OpSpecs. So the OpSpecs, kind of just going back to it for a second, the OpSpecs is something that both the airline and the FAA conjointly write, if that makes sense, because there's a lot of things that SkyWest will put, okay, these are our people, this is how we operate, this is what we do here, you know, and then the FAA signs off on it, and then that's in your OpSpecs. There's other things that the FAA writes, and like authorizations and exemptions, that they just grant to the airline, and then that also goes on record, goes in the OpSpecs. So it's kind of, they both help, you know, they both contribute to this book, or whatever you want to call it, this document. Okay, so that's it for everything Part 91 and 119. 119 just had 2 things, and then Part 91 really just had 4 or 5 things. So
you have 2 need to knows after that.
well, the need to knows on the Part 91 is 250 knots under 10,000 feet. That 1, 2, 3 rule, like the alternate always required unless 1, 2, 3 rule. You don't need to know the alternate minimums in this one or the takeoff minimums. You need the OpSpecs. You need to be able to list the five or so things that go into the OpSpecs. That's really it. There's not a quiz question on the these 5 position requirements here. However, I know that there's ADX questions on that. So it might be a good one to memorize because it might help you on an ADX question. But as far as a quiz question in here, I don't have a quiz question on that. The other thing is a lot of airlines call these things something slightly different. So I don't really like to put a lot of emphasis on them because the only time you ever even need to know or care about this would be like in this environment. Once you are dispatching and stuff, you wouldn't even remember these to save your life. So you never need to know that. Okay, so let's begin looking at 121. Okay, so in this one, for those of you that watched the intro video onto the 121, anything that I put a red box around is a need to know item. It might not, there is a lot of stuff, so not all of it is going to show up on a quiz, okay? I can tell you that. There are a few, and I'll try and be more specific with the ones that will be quiz questions, but when I put the red box around it, that means something that highly likely that you could get, you might see on the ADX, you might be getting like in an interview type question, just stuff that you'll want to know. It may not be a quiz, but it's stuff that if you don't learn it immediately, it's stuff ultimately, you're going to be forced to remember one way or another. So the first one is talking about communications facilities. So now this is 121 again, now only looking at the ones that are most important to dispatch, and even furthermore just looking at the ones that are highlighted and red boxed in here. So but these are the specific 121 rules. So now we're talking about airline specific. These rules only apply to people operating flights that are carrying passengers, paying passengers, scheduled service. So this is where you get into a lot of that certificate holder, administrator, all that different lingo. So this certificate holder means airline. So each airline conducting domestic or flag operations must show that a two-way communication system or means of communication approved by the FAA certificate holding district office is available over the entire route. The communications may be direct links or via an approved communication link that will provide reliable and rapid communications under normal operating conditions between each airplane and the appropriate dispatch office, and between each airplane and the appropriate air traffic control unit. Let's just talk about that for a second. So when you start seeing 121 stuff, you're going to notice there's stuff that is both more restrictive and more lenient in some cases. Now, this is an example of something that is more restrictive. Because you have people that are paying you to take you from point A to point B, and they expect to arrive safely, you have this requirement. So this is one of the first requirements, is you have to have two-way communication over the entire route of flight, okay? That basically means that the dispatcher and the pilot in command always need to be able to communicate with each other. If it cannot go into any point, it cannot fly in any area where that communication might be interrupted or might not be available. Okay? There's several different ways that we can accomplish this, but it has to exist. Two-way radio communication has to exist. The other thing is they always have to fly in an area where they can talk to air traffic control. So the plane needs to always be able to communicate with the dispatcher and air traffic control, always. If it's not allowed to fly in an area where one of those two might be compromised. Now, we're not necessarily talking about like, hey, calling somebody up on the radio and, breaker 19 CB lingo stuff. But you probably heard me talk about like ACARS systems before. So that's like the text messaging system. The dispatcher can send a message to the crew just from their computer. ATC obviously talks over the radio, but ACARS works via the radio though. So if I'm sending a text message on my ACARS software to send to the plane, the only way the plane's going to receive that is if he's within the ACARS radio coverage area. So it still is a radio frequency service type thing. So in order to receive those, it's just quicker, you're not having to like call them up. There's other ways though, like that we can talk to our crews. Like if they're in an area that does not have ACARS coverage, then we have a few other types of services that we have available to us. One of them is called AirRink radio. AirRink, actually, these next two things are the same thing. They're just different brands, if that makes sense. So one is called AirRink, and then there's another one called Atlanta radio. Some people call it Delta radio. But what it is, it's basically I pick up my phone at work and I dial like a 1-800 number, which calls either this company, AirRink, or the other company, the Delta radio. And it can actually do an operator, and you say, hey, I'm trying to get in touch with my flight SkyWest 4494. And they'll say, okay, what area is he flying over right now? And then you kind of look on the map. Oh, he's over in northern Minnesota. And that person, the operator, actually will look up what the frequency is for that area, and they'll tune in their radio to that area of the country, and then they will do a phone patch. And so they'll connect your phone to the radio, and then they'll actually call them on the radio, and the operator person, will call in and say, SkyWest 4494, this is Atlanta radio, your dispatcher, would like to talk to you. And so they'll get on and say, oh, yeah, Atlanta radio, yeah, go ahead and patch him through or whatever. So then they'll go ahead and then they'll come back on and say, okay, dispatcher, I have them on the line, go ahead and talk. And so you can get on the phone and you can just talk to them basically on the phone.
Is that something that you guys do?
It happens occasionally. It's not very often. I'm trying to think of how many times per year that might actually happen. Maybe, gosh, even being a shift manager, which it would happen more, for me, because a lot of the calls, all of the calls will route through either the dispatch supervisor. Like, for instance, if the crew is trying to call the dispatcher, it can go either way. The dispatcher can initiate it, and he can call the operator person who can patch him in with the plane. But sometimes it's the plane that doesn't have ACARS, and they're trying to send us a message so that they call the operator person on their radio, and then they call us. So when that call comes into us, it always comes into either the shift manager or the dispatch supervisor. So that's where it'll automatically go, and then we get it, and then we figure out whose flight it is, and then transfer it. So even considering that, probably less than 10 times a year.
Oh, wow.
Total. Yeah.
Is there a lot of area where there is no communication?
Well, like ACARS communication?
Yeah, because that's what we're talking about is you have to have two-way radio communication, so there must be some place in the United States where it's...
In the United States, I can't think of any place. The entire United States is covered, will be covered by one of those things. Sometimes you don't have ACARS communication at an airport, like on the ground at an airport, but that's not a big deal because they're on the ground. And they usually, even in that case, they can usually still talk to air traffic control, and they usually are still within either Air Rink radio or Delta radio coverage. So even if that were the case, I mean, if they're on the ground, they can even call from their own phone at that point, right? So we have that communication with them there, but when they're in the air, ACARS is even pretty much 100%. But what might happen, though, is your ACARS unit might go in-op on you, or it might malfunction, stop working. In that case, then you would need that other, you would have to have the two-way radio, which is still the same. It's pretty much the same amount of coverage. There are some areas of Canada and Alaska that don't have them, that you have to route your plane special in order to stay in them. But very rare, though, in general, very rare. The other situations would be that you get a lot of those phone call patches would be in like medical emergencies. Sometimes if you have a passenger on the plane that's experiencing some sort of, medical emergency, they'll call and, because it's faster communication at that point, get us on the line to where we can talk instead of typing back and forth like texting, They'll get on the line and then they'll kind of describe what's going on. Sometimes we will patch in like a medical doctor. Like we have a service through the University of Pittsburgh, but they provide actually most of the in-flight medical services for pretty much every airline. So, but we'll there's always an on-call doctor, depending on which airline. We patch them in with them, and then they can talk directly to the crew. In some cases, they can even talk to the flight attendant. I'm not sure, Andrea, if you have any experience with that at all. I'm sure you have medical emergencies, plenty of those experiences, but anywhere you've talked to anybody, like radio-wise?
The only time I have seen Airlink work is I assisted on Alaska mainline with a medical emergency, and they used the Airlink.
Oh, sorry. My thing was muted, if you don't mind starting over.
I've never had to at SkyWest, but one time on an Alaska mainline flight, they had me assist them, and they used the Airlink.
Okay, so they patched in with like a doctor, like the on-call.
Yeah, until a doctor finally came and helped. But for me with the Airlink, like there's always been somebody. Even that time it wasn't an emergency where I felt we needed it, but it was a nice option to have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is pretty interesting, like I went to, it was like a year or two ago, but I went to, SkyWest sent me out to go to like a conference with one of these, I think it was the University of Pittsburgh, and talking about their like medical patching services. And so it was kind of interesting what they said though. They basically said, depending on, I mean, it depends a lot on the airline individually, but some airlines they get a lot more phone calls from, and some hardly call them at all. But kind of like what Andrew was saying, a lot of times, and in most cases, on every flight, it seems like there's usually a nurse or a doctor or somebody medically trained that will usually step in and assist and kind of give their opinion. One thing though, even about that though, that's kind of interesting compared to what these on-call doctor people say, is that usually somebody on a plane, even though they're medically trained, usually they don't, it's kind of that like, if that thought of like taking liability for like any decisions that are made, like somebody will end up asking the question, well, do you think we need to divert? Like, is this a situation where we need to land at the nearest suitable airport because this person might need, to go to the emergency room or whatever, right? And so a lot of times just simply out of like not wanting to be liable by saying, oh no, they're fine, let's just continue, like they'll usually say divert. But I went to this conference thing and these people, and it is a tough decision, obviously, whether it be the crew, the flight attendants, or even a passenger that's medically trained to actually make these decisions. It's one thing to be in the situation and to be there on the ground, like quarterbacking it, But one thing they say is that there's only 3 reasons that you should ever divert the flight for. One is pregnant or birth, giving birth was the first one they named. 2 was bleeding from like the carotid artery area. And 3, I can't remember what the third one was. What's that?
Possible heart attack.
What's funny is I don't even think it was that. Like it was, I mean, maybe it was. I have to look it up again because now I can't even remember. But they basically say that, I mean, they say that about 75% of most of their calls are usually just somebody unconscious or going in and out of consciousness, fainting, and typically they'll usually just have them lay down, drink orange juice, get their feet up, but they usually never divert for it. The ones that they say that that you should divert. Yeah, I'll have to look. I can't remember what that. It probably is something along like cardiac arrest. But I'm sure. I'm actually, now that I think about it, I'm sure it would have to be something like that. But but yeah, it was just kind of weird to hear that because a lot of times you don't know what's going on, and so you just immediately divert. But a lot of times you get those medical patch people on the line, and the first thing they'll say is, "Okay, don't divert. Just continue to your destination." It's kind of, sometimes it's the opposite of what you're expecting to hear, but anyway.
There's a bone showing. Okay.
Oh, actually, that's what it was.
Even when I don't know anything, I know everything.
No, it was compound fracture. Yeah. Yeah, it was compound fracture. Yeah, that actually is. So it was giving birth, bleeding, carotid area, and compound fracture.
How would you get a compound fracture?
I don't know. But that's funny that you said that. The reason why they say, I guess, with the heart attack thing is that
It's usually too late.
it's usually too late. There is the equipment on board that somebody normally
I think
can
that'd be a
use.
little bit rough. Yeah, he's down on the ground. Oh well, moving back to coach. Let's go.
Oh my God.
Rough.
So anyway, just kind of an interesting little side topic there, but yep, on the nose. I'll go turn it off in a minute. But anyway, so yeah, that communication, the two-way radio communication, always has to exist in one form or another, whether it be ACARS, AirRink, Atlanta Radio. You can never not be in two-way communication. with both ATC and your dispatcher. So that always has to exist. Otherwise, it's you're breaking this FAR. So remember that. So weather reporting facilities. Each airline conducting domestic or flag operations must show that enough weather reporting services are available along each route to ensure weather reports and forecasts necessary for the operation. That one's pretty basic. I mean, if you're flying, especially domestically, you're flying over hundreds of different airports which report weather along your route. So that's normally not ever a problem. I mean, it might be a problem if you're flying, over water somewhere. You don't have weather reports going on. But for domestic operations especially, you just have to ensure that there's enough weather reporting stations, which that almost, in fact, I don't think it ever has come up for any flight that I've ever dispatched. So, but it is a rule. Know that, I guess. It talks in this next part that you can't use a weather report unless it's approved by the National Weather Service. If it's got to be approved by the FAA, just little different things like that. Nothing that's too crazy that you need to really learn. And route navigation facilities, this just basically talks about how when you're flying that you have to have enough, whether they be like the ground-based navigation, so VORs, things like that on the ground to navigate with, or even just the satellite navigation. Depending on what works and doesn't work on your airplane, what MELs you have and don't have, you just have to ensure that along your route you have proper navigation facilities. With the satellite part of it, that would be really just satellite coverage, like the RAIM thing that we've talked about last time. If you're flying through an area where you're relying on GPS but you don't have the RAIM coverage, then that's a problem. You have to ensure that you have RAIM coverage, and if not, you've got to ensure that you have the ground-based navigation coverage wherever you're flying. Dispatch centers. Each airline conducting domestic or flag operations must show that it has enough dispatch centers adequate for operations to be conducted that are located at points necessary to ensure proper operational control of each flight. This just basically, this is kind of intentionally left vague. No airline that I know of has more than just one dispatch center, whether they be Delta, United, SkyWest, doesn't matter. I've never heard of anyone having more than one OCC dispatch center. OCC, for those of you that don't know, stands for Operational Control Center, but that's the dispatch center that's referred to here. It's basically leaving it up to the airline to decide how many they need, and I'm sure every airline, for the sake of profitability, decides that they don't need more than one. And most airplanes fly from a 121 standpoint. Garrett chimes in and says maybe smaller companies, but any airline that I know of, whether they be a tiny airline 121, I've never heard of anyone. We're specifically talking 121 here. So if it's a 135 like Ameriflight, something like that, that's not a 121 carrier, you might have something different, but they don't even require dispatchers at all in the first place. So but when you're talking 121, all 121 flights have to be overseen and authorized by a dispatcher. 121 is the only one that has that rule. So anyway, you have to have enough operational control centers, dispatch centers, to ensure that you have proper safety. So like I said, that's normally just one, regardless of how big you are. Flight following system. Each airline conducting Now let's go to so that's supplemental, so that's 135. Supplemental. Each airline conducting supplemental operations must show that it has an approved flight following system established in accordance with subpart U of this part and adequate for the proper monitoring of each flight, considering the operations to be conducted. Flight following centers located at those points necessary to ensure proper monitoring of the progress of each flight with respect to its departure at the point of origin and arrival at its destination, including intermediate stops and diversions, and maintenance or mechanical delays encountered at those points or stops, to ensure that the pilot in command is provided with all information necessary for the safety of flight. An airline conducting supplemental operations may arrange to have the flight following facilities provided by persons other than its employees, but in such cases, the airline continues to be primarily responsible for operational control of each flight. So what this is talking about is you have to have some sort of a system that will tell you as the dispatcher where your flight is at all times. Okay? For those of you that have been into the OCC, we have that big map. Like everybody has the map. In fact, I think you guys have all seen it. Have you seen it, Aubrey?
No, I didn't.
So Aubrey's the only one that hasn't seen it. Some of you online maybe haven't seen it. I know. I'm not sure if have you ever been into an OCC, Andrea?
I have not.
Okay. But so basically it's just, a big map that has all of our airplanes on it showing where they're at all times. We can see all of our airplanes where they're flying, and just basically pick up the feed, kind of like radar is, except it's not exactly, it doesn't work like radar does. We're not sending out a signal and having it return to us and showing up as little blips on the map. But it's really just the signal from the airplane. We receive like an ACARS signal, and then we also receive a feed from the FAA that shows us where all of our planes are at all times. So we normally can see, especially if they're not communicating back and forth, like if we send an ACARS message, even though we know they're in ACARS coverage, sometimes they don't get the message. Sometimes ATC is trying to talk to our planes and they're not responding to ATC. Like maybe sometimes they might be on the wrong frequency or may have bumped it and tuned it to the wrong one, So now ATC is trying to talk to them. They're not responding. ATC calls us, the dispatcher, and says, hey, your flight so-and-so, we know he's not responding to us. We need him to be on this frequency. Then the dispatcher will send an ACARS saying, hey, ATC is looking for you. They want you on this frequency, So then that'll trigger maybe I need to check that, So there's a lot of things like that happen, but we can see where it's at all times. So you always need to be able to know where your flight is. That's basically what this is saying. You have to have some sort of a system that tells you where your flights are. The one we use, we pay a company called WSI, and they give us that feed. So it's actually one of the cooler software things that you'll deal with as a dispatcher.
WSI, the people that run Pilot Brief.
Yep. They're our approved weather vendor. I'm gonna go ahead and turn that off real quick.
I don't remember, it might be at the maybe it just keeps it off of you. Even if it's not warm, you're not doing it. When you went to it, another one. See, I think that they were being made to burn and keeping it warm. It's not even working. I feel the life. You're full of don't know what to say, like,
How do you wrap your legs around each other more than one?
like that.
Gumby.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. So yeah, I've got to have a flight following system. So basically these two things are kind of the same here. So you have to be able to just know where your aircraft is at all times. This next part is talking about takeoff limitations for turbine engine powered airplanes. It's basically saying that no person operating a turbine engine powered airplane may take off at a weight greater than that listed in the airplane flight manual for the elevation of the airport and ambient temperature existing at takeoff. Basically saying that you're not allowed to take off at more than your max takeoff weight. That's why we have the max takeoff weight, right? Kind of a dumb thing, but it's in there. No person operating a turbine engine powered aircraft may take off that airplane at a weight greater than that listed in the airplane flight manual for the minimum distances required for takeoff. It's just telling you kind of a whole criteria of like minimum takeoff distance, minimum takeoff weight, or maximum takeoff weight. Like you can't exceed the limitations that the manufacturer has provided for us that say that, hey, this is your max takeoff weight. These are your limitations. You can't not follow its guidelines. So instead of reading through all of these, just kind of know that that's what it's talking about in general. Turbine engine powered airplanes, en route limitations, one engine and up. No person operating a turbine engine powered airplane may take off that airplane at a weight allowing for normal consumption of fuel and oil that is greater than that which, under the approved one engine and operative en route net flight path data in the airplane flight manual for that airplane, will allow compliance with those paragraphs above that we just read through, that we didn't read through but mentioned. This talks about drift down, 1,000 feet terrain, obstructions. It's basically just telling us that we can't exceed those weight limitations that would make us too heavy that if one of our engines failed that we couldn't clear the drift down 1 performance and then the drift down 2 depending on which one we're using. All of that is obviously based on the weight of the aircraft. So everything is just really referring back to the fact that we plan everything as if one engine is going to fail, that we have to be able to complete all of our flights even if one engine failed. So it's basically telling us that we can't ever exceed that weight that would make us too heavy that if one engine failed, we would drift down and, fly into a mountain or hit the ground or whatever. So landing limitations. No person operating a turbine engine powered airplane may take off that airplane at a weight that would be over our max. This is basically talking now about our max landing weight. But in addition to that, there's also another rule in here. This is one you're going to want to know. I don't believe it's a quiz question, but this is really one that you want to know as a dispatcher. This is called the 60% rule. All of our flights that we plan as dispatchers are planned to land within only using 60% of the runway at our destinations. So if I'm dispatching a plane to Salt Lake City and I know Salt Lake City has a 10,000 foot runway. It really has a 12,000 foot runway, but for the sake of doing easier math, let's just say it's a 10,000 foot runway. We need to be able to demonstrate that our plane could land in only 6,000 feet. So even though it's a 10,000 foot runway, we have to be able to show that we can actually land on that runway and only use 60% of it. Does that make sense? That's your 60% rule. Now that's just for dispatch planning purposes. When the pilot actually gets up in the air and they're typing in their landing performance, they can actually use 100%. But from a dispatch planning perspective, we can only use 60%. So if my flight shows, see, Garrett says on the ADX that they love this question. So this is, I guess this is one that maybe you'll see. So if I have a 10,000 foot runway, but my performance calculations show that I'm actually going to need 7,000 feet to land or in order to stop the plane, then I'm exceeding that 60%. And what basically happens at that point is you would take a weight hit on the plane, like a payload hit, in order to reduce the weight of the plane down to a weight that would allow it to stop in 60%. So if I do all my initial weight and balance, comes back, run the performance, it comes back and tells me that it needs 7,000 feet to land. I have a 10,000 foot runway. Well, I'm going to have to take off, kick a few people off the plane with their bags, get it down to a weight that would be allowable to actually stop in 6,000 feet. So there's a lot of when you start to realize the amount of safeguards that are in there for planning 121 flights, you'll start to see why. I mean, when you look at the numbers, obviously airplane crashes and incidents are very rare. People dying on airplanes is very rare. Doesn't happen very much. But the safety protocols that are in place are so great that you'll start to see why nothing ever happens. That it takes really dramatic things to have go wrong. Like losing both engines or something like that, in order for anything to really happen. So we have to be able to land 60% of the runway. That's obviously one of those rules. So planning all flights with one engine is another one of those things too. So all of those are just safety measures that we take. Now, if you're flying a turboprop, not a turbojet, you can actually use 70%. But that's only if you're a turboprop. So no, in case that's on the ADX, turbojet, 60% of the runway, turboprop, 70%. There's also other little things with that rule that you can do. You can list an alternate, and these are what are called performance alternates. But if you list an alternate that shows a different airport that you could land within 60% of the runway at that airport, it'll allow you to go over 60% at your destination. Mm-hmm. Anyway, those are called performance alternates, but it is kind of rare to ever see. If you ever get a runway that, if you're looking through NOTAMs and things and you see a runway that is wet, then you have to do what is called wet performance planning. And in those cases, it's this next little paragraph here, but it says if the destination airport runway is indicated to be wet or slippery at the estimated time of arrival, the destination airport is at least, I have to use 115% of the runway length required under that previous paragraph. So it's kind of confusing, but if the runway is reported as wet, you start out with the 60%, right? So going back to my 10,000 foot example, I can only use 6,000 feet of that. if that runway is being reported as wet, then you have to take an even further 15% penalty. So you actually have to take an additional 1,500 feet off of that. So now you have to be able to land 4,500 feet. And it's based off of the entire runway length. So now you're talking about a situation where you have to land in less than half of the entire runway distance. So the thing about this is this is not normally a problem. We have runway lengths that we fly to all over the place that are, the entire runway. Like as an example, has anyone ever flown into Orange County? I know Andrea has, probably plenty. But Orange County, John Wayne Airport, Southern California, right by Disneyland, kind of. That runway, the full runway length is only 5,700 feet. So imagine thinking of the 60% rule on that runway. What's 60% of 5,700?
6,000. 3,000.
Yeah, ish, somewhere. So we have to be able to land in a little over 3,000 feet at that runway. And that's all the time. Our airplanes, though, rarely take performance penalties at Orange County, though. So that just goes to show you, the performance of these airplanes. And remember, that's all one engine, too. So you start to think of, well, geez, 2 engines and all the extra benefit that we actually have if we could really plan for it. It's really actually pretty safe when you start thinking about it. But even on a runway that's only 5,700 feet long, we have to show that we can land in a little over 3,000 feet total. Now, obviously, that's landing and really kicking the brakes pretty hard and stopping. But they have to be able to show that they can do that, or it'll take a weight penalty. And we rarely take a weight penalty. Now, if the Orange County Airport is being reported as wet, then we take huge penalties out of Orange County. Another one is Burbank. Burbank, really short runways. When it's being reported as wet, it'll sometimes bump half of the plane off. In fact, just a few weeks ago, it wasn't due to being wet, but it was due to really high temperatures. They had 40 degrees Celsius temperatures and above in Burbank, and we had a flight that had to bump off 30 some odd people off of a 200. You're talking most of the plane, yeah. So different variations. Wet just makes it so that the distance even gets decreased even further, that you have to be able to show that you can stop. And then, temperature, a lot of different things are going to factor in. But, it gets pretty crazy, though. Nice big long runways are always really nice. Landing limitations, alternate airports. This one is kind of going back to talking about alternate airports also have that same 60% rule. Like, it doesn't matter whether it's the destination or the alternate, you still got to be able to land 60%. Turboprops, 70%, and turbojet, 60%, kind of same thing. This next little part is differences training, crew members and dispatchers. There just talks about how they have to all go through the appropriate ground training and differences training between different types of aircraft that the airline flies. Initial transition ground training, same thing, just goes over the different requirements for, learning weather systems, learning about aircraft systems, all of these things that it's listing in here. Dispatcher responsibilities, PIC responsibilities, which PIC is pilot in command, weight and balance. These are all things you go over in new hire training when you get hired at an airline. Recurrent training talks about how every year you have to go through a certain amount of hours of training per year just to become requalified as a dispatcher. talks about what is required in recurrent training. So a lot of these things, any of the stuff in here, when you go back through, like I'm really only touching on the ones that have the red boxes around them, just because it takes forever to go through these. But you probably want to go back and look through the ones that are highlighted. The ones that are highlighted are, like Garrett's saying here, they can be interview questions, but even more specifically, a lot of these are going to be ADX material. Like this recurrent training one here, I know that there's ADX questions about recurrent training requires what? It's got to be a combination of a quiz, a competency check, and instruction or something like that. But these are where you're going to get a lot of that information from. This next part that's highlighted here is talking about how a pilot in command that has less than 100 hours of flying time in that type of aircraft can't be paired with a first officer that also has less than 100 hours. This is called a green on green rule. It basically means an inexperienced captain with an inexperienced first officer. You can't ever have them both flying at the same time, on the same flight. Yeah. It's rare, pretty rare though.
When you open up a new base, or like when Brasilia got canned, started to open up a lot more like Airspace and stuff.
Yeah.
People started transitioning. Those.
Sometimes you'd have first officers that had more time than the captains. In those cases, it was pretty weird. Dispatcher qualifications and duty time. This is basically jumping into the qualifications for dispatchers. No airline conducting domestic or flag operations may use any person, nor may any person serve as an aircraft dispatcher for a particular airline group or airplane group, unless that person has, with respect to an airplane of that group, satisfactorily completed the following: initial dispatcher training, except that person who has satisfactorily completed such training for another type of airplane of the same group need only complete the appropriate transition training, and operating familiarization consisting of at least 5 hours observing operations from the flight deck for airplanes without an observer seat in the flight deck from a forward passenger seat with a headset on or speaker. So that's 5 hours, basically just talking about the 5 hours per year that dispatchers have to do in the jump seat. It can be reduced to only 2.5 hours by the substitution of one additional takeoff and landing for an hour of flight. A person may serve as an aircraft dispatcher without meeting the requirement of this paragraph for 90 days after the initial introduction of the airplane into operations under this part. So basically saying you got to do your jump seating within 90 days of completing your new hire training. If 90 days go by, you still haven't done your jump seating, then you are not authorized to be a dispatcher.
Is that usually something you have to do in your off time?
No, they schedule it. So what happens, you go through new hire training, then you do all your desk training, and then they do a comp check at the end of all that. If you pass the comp check, SkyWest schedules it so that you do your jump seating before you even dispatch. So take your comp check. If you pass your comp check, then you'll be scheduled for like 3 days off, and you got to do your jump seating on one of those 3 days. But it's paid for. It's like you're working, but it's paid for. You get per diem in 12 hours of OT pay, I think. So.
What's a comp check?
Comp check is just the kind of the practical check at the end of your training. You sit with them and you sit there and you dispatch flights and you show that you can work a desk basically and handle whatever problems. They just sit there and watch you for several hours and see how you handle things basically. And then they'll ask you questions and things like that too. So This next part talks about, it's like the same thing. A lot of times you have a lot of the like repeat things for one for domestic, one for flag, but a lot of times they're the same thing. So the next part talks about flag operations, but it talks about the same requirement, 5 hours. The only difference in flag operations is that it talks about that if you, let's say you're getting qualified to dispatch a 747, well, it talks about how you would need to go do jump seating in a 747 or an airplane in that type. The problem is that airplanes in that type are not normally just doing a little puddle jump flight that you could just go jump seat on. So in order to go jump seat on a big jumbo wide body plane, that usually means you're going to have to go to Asia or Europe, you know? So, because you're not just going to be able to go get on for 5 hours and then jump off or whatever, you know, have them drop you off somewhere. So you're going to normally have to stay there all the way to, you know, 16 hours could be even be, you know, in some cases. So.
I thought we could jump seat in
International.
Yeah, well, and that's another problem too, is you can't. You can't jump seat international. But the thing is about it is so that you'll have one of those two problems is even if it was a flight that say you could jump seat on, it's normally going to be way over 5 hours. Like, let's say you're going New York to Honolulu. That's technically a flight you could jump seat on, but that's like a 10-hour flight. So just as an example, you're not going to go jump seating on that flight because it's way more hours than you need, first of all. And then secondly, the FAA realizes that the majority of flights that those types of planes operate are ones that are international anyway that you can't jump seat on. So they basically are saying that you can substitute simulator training, or you basically, and you go and sit and watch them do the simulator instead of actually doing the flight, but in the same type of jet. So
16 hours.
no, for 5.
For 5.
Oh, God.
Yeah, for 5. So the simulators are usually right there, like by a major airport or whatever. So you can just go and observe the simulator training instead of doing the actual jump seat. But you cannot reduce hours on that one. So we'll just cover these last two, then we'll be done for today here. So, duty time limitations. Each airline conducting domestic or flag operations shall establish the daily duty period for a dispatcher so that it begins at a time that allows him or her to become thoroughly familiar with existing and anticipated weather conditions along the route before he or she dispatches any airplane. He or she shall remain on duty until each airplane dispatched by him or her has completed its flight or has gone beyond his or her jurisdiction, or until he or she is relieved by another qualified dispatcher. Except in cases where circumstances or emergency conditions beyond the control of the airline require otherwise, no airline conducting domestic or flag operations may schedule a dispatcher for more than 10 consecutive hours of duty. So you cannot be scheduled for more than 10 hours of duty. The only time you can exceed the 10 hours is if it's an emergency or something going on that requires you to stick around. If a dispatcher, so this is kind of weird, it just gets done telling us that they cannot schedule a dispatcher for more than 10 hours, and then the very next thing it says is if a dispatcher is scheduled for more than 10 hours, as if it's possible. If a dispatcher is scheduled for more than 10 hours of duty in a 24 consecutive hour period, the airline shall provide him or her a rest period of at least 8 hours at or before the end of 10 hours of duty. So, does that make sense?
It's busy.
It's way busy, right? All of these are way busy if you read them. So that's why I try not to read them. So it basically means that you can't, it's going back to the whole thing of saying that if you're scheduled for more than 10 hours of duty in a 24-hour period, so let's say, noon today to noon tomorrow, right? I could technically start at noon. Let's say I've been off for 4 days, so I've had plenty of rest, working up to it. I start dispatching tomorrow at noon, beginning my 10 hours. I go all the way to 10 p.m. That would be a 10-hour shift. Okay, so 10 p.m. and then, yeah, that's a funny question on that, Andrea. Hold on. At 10 p.m., that would be the end of 10 hours. At that point, you would need to basically have an 8-hour rest period. But you could technically work for 10 hours and then have 8 hours off and then come back and work. So if it's 10 p.m., then so you could come back at 6 a.m. and then work from 6 to noon. So if you look at the noon to noon, you technically still worked 16 hours within a 24-hour period. But you did have 8 hours in the middle. So that's kind of what it's saying. You were scheduled for more than 10 hours within 24 hours, but you have to have 8-hour break in between somewhere at the end of 10. So the most you could ever work in a 24-hour period technically is 16, but you have to have, at the end of the 10, you have to have 8 hours off, and then come back on. So that's all that it kind of ultimately is really saying. Each dispatcher must be relieved of all duty with the airline for at least 24 consecutive hours during any 7 consecutive days or the equivalent thereof within any calendar month. It basically means for every 7 straight days that you work, you need a day off. However, it doesn't mean that you need a day off for every 7. Like, for instance, if you work 7 in a row, you don't necessarily have to have a day off. You can technically keep working. So the way this is worded, which is kind of dumb, once again, but it's a loophole, it's saying at the very end of this, it says, I'll just read it again, must be relieved of all duty with the airline for at least 24 hours during any 7 consecutive days or the equivalent thereof within any calendar month. So if I work, how long, let's see, so a month is, let's say on average 30 days, right? If I work 26 straight days. So if you look at it in increments of 7, so you have your first 7 days, you need a day off for that. Then you work another 7, so now you're up to 14 in 1 month. Well, now you need a second day off. Now you work another 7. That's 21 days you've worked that month. Now you need a third day off. It's not saying that every 7 days you need 1 day off. It basically just means that within a calendar month, as long as you have 4 days off, you can continuously work. So if you put 2 months back to back, let's say, if you started off this month, the month of September, with your first 4 days off, you could work the rest of the month straight all the way through the beginning of October, all the way through the end of October. As long as you had the last 4 days of October and the first 4 days of September off, you could work everything in between it. Like I think it comes out to 56 straight days if you wanted to.
You ever known anyone to do that?
There's been people that have been close. I think
The girl we sat with said her,
No.
what was he, husband, I guess, now?
Well, they were engaged.
Yeah.
They were engaged or just barely married, but they said.
Who did you sit with?
A man?
Yeah.
Oh, Ken. Okay, yeah. Yeah, Amanda DeMille. Yeah.
Always works like 26 days.
Yeah, he did.
He's a
Yeah.
workaholic.
He works for Lockheed Martin now, but yeah, he was OT crazy. There's a few of them, but yeah, you could technically do that where as long as you have 8 days off at the beginning of month 1, at the end of month 2, you can work everything in between it. So going back to your question earlier about being extended, that really doesn't apply to dispatchers. You can't be extended, kind of like how flight attendants and or pilot crews get extended. So it's just basically 10 hours straight up, unless there's an emergency. So yeah, Garrett, I love 70+ hour work weeks. Yeah. Eventually you won't. Anyway, we'll just end with that one. So I think that's about it. But yeah, pilot, crews, and flight attendants have totally different sets of rules. But anyway, that's it for today. I would just suggest going back through this document and going through these, especially the ones that are the red box items. We're going to continue to kind of go over this, and we'll probably circle back to this on Saturday once we're back in class here again to continue finishing this off here. So there's a few in here that we didn't quite get to that are really big ones that you really have to have memorized. So not just for this class, but just in general for interviews, for tests, for practical tests, all that stuff. So, all right, cool. Have a good night.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.